The Honorable the President.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Once again, it is an honor to address this House on the bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Services Act, Chapter 3550. And once again, I'm grateful for having the opportunity to point out that while the good intentions of this act are apparent, the devil is always in the detail, Madam President. The devil is always in the detail. And in the case of Tobago, anything to do with pensions has quite a number of details. So that while we are grateful for the acts addressing the issues of the retirement benefits and the preservation of acting capacities for fire officers, we want to say that for us, that is only the start of the matter. Historically, Madam President, we have had grave difficulties in accessing our pensions. Why is that? Madam President, while a public officer who is entitled to pension in Trinidad merely takes himself to his department and so on and gets his emoluments as they were computed, and he gets his letter of appointment and so on, we have several more steps. We have several more hurdles to cross. The first hurdle we have to cross for a public officer working in Tobago is the step of the record keeping of the Tobago House of Assembly. And so the question of pensions, the question of public officers' pensions, including fire officers' pensions, must cross hurdle number one, the record keeping of the Tobago House of Assembly. Madam President, this House would be on notice that there have been several challenges, as noted by the Auditor General, with regard to record keeping for public officers and otherwise, record keeping in general on the part of the Tobago House of Assembly. So this matter is already in the public domain. That is a challenge. Madam President, if you are a public officer, if you are a fire officer stationed in Tobago, God forbid that this is not your only post that you had from the time you started being a public officer till the date of your retirement. If you are looking to put together various terms of service as a public officer from different divisions, particularly if those divisions, any of them are in Trinidad, your problem is amplified. Because now not only are you dealing with the problems intrinsic in Tobago record keeping, you now have to come and virtually put your file together in the various departments in Trinidad. Madam President, that situation is compounded by bottlenecks at the Comptroller of Accounts. There is no Office of the Comptroller of Accounts in Tobago. So once again, if you are trying to reconstruct your public service file and you are forced, you've had a term of office in Trinidad, a term of office in Tobago, to put that together requires several bits of machinations, including confronting bottlenecks at the Comptroller of Accounts. Then you also have to confront bottlenecks at the Auditor General, who is notoriously short-staffed. Again, there is no Office of the Auditor General in Tobago, so that you have the challenge. You have the challenge of reconstructing this file while you're in Tobago and bits and pieces of your file reside 22 miles away and scattered. God forbid, Madam President, that you should try to reconcile this file by phone. That is going to be an abysmal disaster. assuming you get through to any officer that can help you or has knowledge of your file, it is going to be a cold day in hell before that will suffice. So that we really, while I don't want to understate the value that this bill will provide to fire officers, I don't want to understate that at all, but I want to say that implementation of the provisions of this bill and of all bills and all bits of legislation as they refer to pensions, particularly in the Tobago context, must be addressed. Madam President, the Tobago House of Assembly currently processes pensions for its contract officers. So it is clear that the THA has the capacity to process pensions. And so we would want to suggest that mechanisms be put in place at the earliest opportunity so that the Tobago House of Assembly, some of this responsibility, if not all of it, is reposed in the Tobago House of Assembly. The reason for this, Madam President, is that it would alleviate Tobago public officers or public officers who are ending their tenure in Tobago from having to take jaunts down to Trinidad to visit Treasury, to try to reconstruct their file, to go to Auditor General, to go to Comptroller of Accounts. And of course, if you have ever had a conversation with anyone who is running down their pension, you know, Madam President, that this is not one excursion. And with the current challenges of having an excursion between Trinidad and Tobago, one can appreciate the frustration that is occasioned by this endeavor. So we want to suggest respectfully to the government that in assessing or determining how this bill and similar legislation is rolled out, that attention be paid particularly to how it is rolled out in Tobago and how Tobagonians access their pensions. We want to also point out that when you look at the 2011 census, it tells a particular story about how many people are likely to be affected by this bit of legislation and by any other legislation that involves pensions. And speaking only to the Tobago experience, of our population of 60,000 people odd in the 2011 census, we have 23,000 people over 40, 19,000 people over 50, and 8,000 people over the age of 60. Madam President, what does that mean? It means 10%, a full 10% of the entire population, not the working population, but 10% of the entire population is approaching retirement age or are beyond retirement age. So when we look at our over 50s, we have 19,000, that's 30%. So you have a full 40% approaching retirement, at retirement, or beyond retirement. That is a large percentage of your population. It tells you that many, if not most, of the working population of Tobago are of retirement age. So when we look at how we implement this act, we have to be sensitive because implementation in the Tobago context will affect or does affect quite a disproportionately large segment of that economy. Now, previous speakers have mentioned to the government or have informed the government that there have been challenges in the past with people awaiting pensions. And speakers have mentioned that they are aware of people who have been waiting as long as 2 years. In the Tobago context, people are awaiting pensions for more than 4 years. More than 4 years.
4 years?
Persons are awaiting their pensions. And this is because of the problems that I outlined. that is jumping through the THA hoop, having to reconstruct your file between Trinidad and Tobago, having to jump through the Auditor General hoop, having to jump through the Comptroller of Accounts hoop. Now, Madam President, you can just imagine someone who has dedicated their life to public service. They have retired. They are looking forward to this pension. They are looking forward to this gratuity. Persons of advanced age have particular needs. In particular, they have healthcare challenges in some cases. And you are there without an income, waiting 1 year, no pension, 2 years, no pension, 3 years, not a cent, 4 years. Madam President, I am aware firsthand of persons in Tobago who have died waiting on their pensions. It is extremely sad. And because there appears to be no way out, there is a sense of hopelessness surrounding the persons who are advancing towards retirement and the persons who are at retirement waiting. And so it behooves this government that while it tries to get things right with regard to the fire officers, that it also make a good faith attempt to get it right with regard to the payment of the benefits that are now entitled, these fire officers are now entitled to. Because, Madam President, it's no good to tell me I have a right if I can't access it. It is no good to give me a benefit when I literally have to die before it is available. It is no good to give me a benefit when the cost of getting the benefit is akin to the benefit itself. So that I want to suggest to the Minister that because it is conceivable that the situation with regard to accessing pensions in Tobago has escaped the government's attention. Tobago, after all, is not Port of Spain, and many things escape ordinary notice. So that I want to ask her to throw an eye on Tobago in the administration of pensions. And while I am at it, Madam President, I want to mention the pensions, or the gratuity, rather, of daily paid workers. Daily paid workers who are already at the bottom of the rung in terms of earning. These workers are ordinarily get a one-off payment. So can you imagine? You're already working for little or no money. All you're going to get at the end of this service as a daily paid worker is a little one-off payment. But you have to wait 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, for, as Senator Mark would say, the little kakada. It is not right. It puts pressure on persons who have served in the capacity to which they have been called and have served in good faith, knowing that the government, or expecting that the government would have put things in place to ensure that they smoothly transition from their working life into their retirement. There is no evidence, Madam President, that that happens on the Tobago landscape. Now, in deciding how best to implement a meaningful change in the administration of pensions as they relate to public officers in Tobago, I would like to respectfully suggest that consideration be given to, one, having the Tobago House of Assembly manage all the pensions of Tobago public officers. They have the capacity to do it. They do it now for their contract workers, and it would simply be a matter of training and properly provisioning the relevant department so that they can take this responsibility out of Port of Spain. That's the first thing. The second matter is that it is really high time that all the arms of government that deal with the management and allocation and computation and payment of pensions, that they also reside in one place in Tobago. These arms must come together. Now, I know Minister may say that there are budgetary constraints and so on, and I am sensitive to that. But there was a system that was in existence many years ago where these arms would come together and perhaps do 3 days a month in Tobago, so that the officers, the public officers, retirees that were affected could all come to the same place at the same time in a known period and get some assistance, rather than running up and down between the two islands like headless chickens and meeting a different officer every time, and just being wholly frustrated and overwhelmed by the process. I want to suggest that the minister have regard to the institutional knowledge of these various arms, and that she note that there is a precedent, there was a precedent set, and that she give active consideration to returning to that model in whole or in part to offer some relief to persons awaiting pensions in Tobago. Because, Minister, Madam President, these persons are genuinely suffering. They are genuinely suffering. With regard to the persons more directly or most directly impacted by this legislation, we make note of the auxiliary officers, the auxiliary fire officers. And in Tobago, they comprise of 1 divisional fire officer, an assistant divisional fire officer, 6 fire sub-officers, and 38 firefighters. And out of that complement, 9 of them are working 8 to 4. And they are waiting anxiously to see if this legislation will bring relief to their complement, because historically there has been a huge challenge with members of this group even having the right to or the entitlement to a pension. So on behalf of that group, there is certainly support for the measure and certainly a sense of relief that attention and a spotlight is being thrown on these men and women. However, Madam President, the devil is in the detail, and it would be a shame if the minister and the technocrats involved in the ministry were to go through this entire exercise and it were to stall because of implementation challenges. And I want to say in Tobago, it is almost guaranteed to stall because of these challenges, because every other bit of legislation or entitlement or right that allows for the payment of a pension has stalled. Madam President, the Honourable Senator Mark mentioned earlier that members of the last Parliament are still waiting 20 months for their pensions and gratuity. So there's a problem in the system. I want to point out to this Honourable House that members who sat here from the island of Tobago also are waiting, but they have added to the challenges the frequent trips back and forth between Tobago and Port of Spain and Treasury and here and there, simply to get a right realized. And it is not fair. It is not fair. It is not fair to Senator Mark, who sat here. It's not fair to any of the persons who chose to serve and served honorably in this Parliament. But it is even, the incidence of unfairness falls harder on our brothers and sisters who sit here and reside in Tobago. So, Minister, through you, Madam President, if Minister would, and the government and the relevant departments, show a care for the exceptional hardship of persons awaiting pensions in Tobago and show a care for how this legislation and similar pieces of legislation are going to be rolled out in Tobago, and put in place a system where all these arms could come together, if not on one permanent basis in one office, then certainly once a week every month, or once a week every other month, because retirees do not always enjoy the best of health. They do not enjoy as much disposable income as persons who are in full employment. They have various challenges, and there are other systemic challenges, not the least of which are the sea bridge and the air bridge, that makes this trek really close to impossible. So on that note, Madam President, I am grateful for the promise offered by the Act, but I must caution that with this promise, much more is required by way of in order to achieve successful implementation in Tobago. I thank you.
Senator Ramdeen.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I stand to contribute to this bill, which is an act to amend the Fire Services Act, Chapter 3550, to deal with one issue and one issue alone, Madam President, which I consider is quite important having regard to what is proposed by this legislation. It deals with the issue of differing treatment to persons who might be caught as fire officers, Madam President, and the impact of this amendment on those persons. What I want to deal with particularly, Madam President, is the proposed amendment to Section 7A, which provides that a fire officer, A, who has acted in a higher office for a continuous period of at least 3 years. And what I want to take issue with, Madam President, is the words immediately prior to the date, 1, of his compulsory retirement, or 2, on which he proceeds on annual leave before the date of his compulsory retirement, shall be eligible to have his pension, gratuity, or other allowance calculated as if he was substantively appointed to that higher office. Madam President, why I want to take issue with the amendment is because it is clear that there is, in this provision, there is inbuilt a basis for different persons, or similarly circumstanced persons to be treated differently. And the way in which they are being treated differently, Madam President, is by the words immediately prior to the date of either the compulsory retirement or on which he proceeds on annual leave. Madam President, each and every citizen of this country has a right to equal treatment by a public authority. It is a right that is guaranteed by Section 4D of our Constitution. And Section 4D of our Constitution has been one of those provisions that has been very popularly litigated by the courts, all the way up to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. And in one of the most recent judgments of the Judicial Committee, delivered on the 9th of March 2015 in the appeal of Anissa Webster and the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, the Judicial Committee set out the approach that must be adopted with respect to this Section 4D right and the way in which persons who are similarly circumstanced are to be treated. And I think that it is important when we treat with legislation of this nature to be able to understand what the impact of the legislation can have on persons. Because this piece of legislation, as simple as it might be, with only 2 clauses, may be a piece of legislation that can find itself the subject of serious litigation. And it can arise in the circumstances where, Madam President, you have someone who is a fire officer who acts in a post but doesn't get to be promoted to the substantive position. And you can have that person acting for a period longer than 3 years, but that period that they are acting in a position for which they are not substantively appointed is a position that doesn't come immediately before that person retires from the service, compulsory, before the age of compulsory retirement, or it doesn't come immediately before the period on which that person proceeds on annual leave. So what you have is that you have a situation where, Madam President, one must be very careful how we legislate. Because when one examines the way in which this right bites on factual circumstances, one must be careful because the Privy Council has said the situations must be comparable, analogous, or broadly similar, but need not be identical. Any differences between them must be material to the difference in treatment. Once such broad comparability is shown, it is for the public authority to explain and justify the difference in treatment. And perhaps the most important principle that comes out of it, Madam President, is that to be justified, the difference in treatment must have a legitimate aim, and there must be a reasonable relationship of proportionality between the means employed and the aim sought to be realized. Now, in piloting the bill, I haven't heard what is the legitimate aim that this legislation proposes to capture by saying that if you act in a position for 3 years, immediately before you go on compulsory retirement or immediately before you go on annual leave, what is the legitimate aim that is captured by that the legislation pursues that is different for those persons from someone who acts in a higher post for a period of 3 years, but that acting period doesn't come immediately before? And I haven't heard anything from the government to justify that. And if that is the position and the legislation seeks to justify that, Madam President, we as the persons who are the legislatures here considering this legislation must demand of the government that they must tell us what is the legitimate aim by limiting this provision to persons who act only for 3 years before. And there's absolutely no justifiable reason why this provision ought not to apply to someone who acts in a higher position for a period of 3 years, but it doesn't precede their retirement from the service. And if you can't provide us with what the legitimate aim is and what is the proportionate response to cutting out these persons to apply in this means to the legislation, then, Madam President, the legislation will be in breach of the equality provisions of our Constitution. It doesn't matter. Well, I might not know how to govern, Madam President, but I know what the law is. I'm a lawyer, not a governor. So, I cannot... I want to get the address of some altar classes, you know. That's what I want to get. No, but Madam, as you please. Madam President, I want to discharge my duty as a legislature. That is what I'm here for. I am here qualified in law, and that is what I can speak to. And as far as I am concerned, it is my duty to bring to your attention if there is a provision that we are asked to approve as a parliament that I consider is in breach of any of the fundamental rights or in breach of the Constitution, and that is simply what I'm seeking to do. If it is that the government doesn't want to take our advice, then, Madam President, they'll be hoisted on their own petard, because it has happened before, and we know that there is very limited ability on the other side when it comes to legal ability and legal advice. So we can only do what we know to do on this side, Madam President, and if those... and
Members, please. No, Senator Amin. Members, please. I would let Senator Ramdeen make his contribution, please. He's entitled to make his contribution. Okay? Senator Ramdeen, continue.
Madam President, thank you for your protection. Madam President, there have been many circumstances through the courts in our country where this idea, it has become systemic now, of persons acting in a higher position. And whereas it is laudable that we are here to compensate persons who have acted in a higher position, it cannot be laudable for us to continue a systemic failure of a public service, where you continue to have a failure of the persons who are mandated to fill these positions and what you have is persons who continue to act in higher positions. It is very demotivating, Madam President, for someone to act in a higher position, retire from that position, and not be entitled to the position that they substantively are entitled to. And it is wrong. And we have had numerous examples, and the question must arise. The government speaks about governance, but they are in government for 20 months. They have promised the people of this country better governance. They were voted in there because they made that promise. And what have we had for 20 months to improve the public service, Madam President? It has been a continuous downfall of contract employment. Contract employment to do what? Contract employment to simply pass on jobs to people who support your party? It's not.
I have to ask you, though, to kind of focus on the bill that is before us, okay?
So, Madam President, I think that having brought this piece of legislation to Parliament, it is just a piecemeal attempt, and it is not going to fix the systemic failures that exist in the system today. This piece of legislation provides a mechanism whereby fire officers can be rewarded for the work that they have done, only those who would have been acting in a higher position immediately before. And I think we must say, Madam President, I have had situations where that provision that Senator Mark had referred to, about 6 months before notice is given, there are people who cannot even buy medication, Madam President. After this, they've retired from the public service. And one has to ensure that if this legislation is passed, that the persons who are to benefit from it will really and truly benefit from it. And one would have thought that we would have been given some kind of assurance by the minister today that things have been put in place at the Comptroller of Accounts Department to fill the vacancies that are there, and or if not, to provide the Comptroller of Accounts with the staff, the resources, the machinery to be able to process this, because we are really going to, this piece of legislation, Madam President, which has good intentions, is really going to amount to nothing if at the end of the day, those limited fire officers who are to benefit from it will retire from the public service, and they will not be able to get their pensions. We should be standing here as a legislature and be able to say to the people who are to be affected by this piece of legislation that we can give them some kind of guarantee that when this legislation is passed, they will be able to access the benefits of it. And if we can't do that, then we really are, I don't want to use the word wasting time, but we really will not achieve anything materially to the persons who are to benefit. So I hope that in this short period of time, this short contribution that I wish to make, that the government would take on board what the real effect of this is. And if they don't, Madam President, I am saying and putting it on the Hansard, that at least the opposition raised the issue that this has the ability to discriminate against a certain sector of persons who are affected by it. And if that is the position, at least when it reaches the courts, it would be something that they would be able to determine, it having been raised here. So I thank you very much, Madam President.
Minister of Labour and Small Enterprises.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, as I rise to bring this debate to a close, I want to recognize the presence of the President of the Fire Services Association, Mr. Leo Ramdeen, who has joined us a short while ago. And I am sure, Madam President, that not only Mr. Ramdeen, in his position as President of the officers for whom this bill is intended in his personal capacity, but all other fire officers are very pleased that this piece of legislation is now in this House and would soon bring relief. But before I proceed further, Madam President, I feel compelled to respond to some of the statements made by my colleagues on the other side. Let me say up front that I I'm really thankful that Senator Mark is the leader of opposition business on that side, because he seems to be the only one on that side to understand the intention of this piece of legislation. Madam President, let me start from the last and come forward. Senator Gerald Ramdeen, he has run away, spoke pure gibberish a little while ago. It made absolutely...
Minister, please, I'm going to ask you to refine what you're saying, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Ramdeen spoke on a subject that he has clearly failed to understand, nor sought to understand. He attempted to tell us that this piece of legislation brings about inequality of treatment. To the contrary, Madam President, this piece of legislation seeks to bring about parity, to bring parity to the fire officers, to bring them on par with public officers, teachers, prison officers, and police officers. So clearly the incoherence I just heard, I will say no more on that. Madam President, I heard the cry of the newly minted Senator Christlyn with regards to Tobago, and certainly the suggestion made is a suggestion worthy of exploration, and I shall certainly convey it to the Minister of Finance. But I want Senator Moore spoke about persons awaiting pensions in Tobago for as much as 4 years. It's the first time I have heard such a statement made, and I am very, very familiar with pension arrangements. And I know that persons, former public officers, have to wait as much as 2 years, but I don't know about 4 years. And I would welcome her to share with me the names of those persons so that something can be done to address their particular issues. Madam President, Senator Khadija Amin spoke about contract workers in state agency and the public service being advertised, and we're not doing anything about contract labor. And no. You said that in my presentation, I spoke about this government abolishing contract labor. I said no such thing. I said the policy framework of this government is reducing our dependency on contract labor. Because, you see, Madam President, contract labor by its very nature cannot be abolished at all. Because depending on the nature of a job, you want an electrician to come in and do a piece of job. You offer a contract. So is a plumber. There are certain jobs which will be done under contract basis. So that this government policy framework has not spoken to the abolition of contract labor, but rather reducing our dependency on contract labor. And I think in my presentation, I have placed enough information before this Honorable House to clearly indicate that this government is working assiduously to bring about that kind of legislative change. Madam President, I turn to my very good friend, Roger Samuel. And clearly, Senator Samuel also did not do his homework, because Senator Samuel mixed up every aspect of what we were trying to do. And he ended by saying we have wasted the time of the Senate because the Public Service Pension Act already made provision for it. Madam President, I'm really surprised at what has been enunciated here by my good friend. I want to share with him and his other colleagues and Trinidad and Tobago that there are different pieces of legislation governing different officers in the public service. So for example, you will have the police coming under the Police Service Act, Chapter 1501. You would have the teachers coming under the Teachers Pension Act, Chapter 3902, and the Assisted Secondary School Teachers Pension Act, Chapter 3903. You would have the prison officers coming under the Prison Service Act, Chapter 1302. As a matter of fact, Madam President, you have the Prime Minister's Pension Act, Chapter 2 of 1951. You also have members of Parliament retiring allowances, Legislative Service Act, Chapter 2 of 2003. You have the judiciary, the Judges' Salaries and Pension Act. So, Madam President, different categories of public officers are governed by different pieces of legislation. So that I trust that I brought some clarity to my very good friend, Senator Roger Samuel, that each of these officers operate under separate pieces of legislation. Madam President, I turn to Independent Senator Dr. Danisha Mahabir, who in his presentation, he asked a question which, for information I would have given in my presentation, whether or not nurses in the RHA and prison officers are eligible for this facility. And I did make that in my presentation, and I think I just repeated it, to indicate all those other categories. And you can't bring the RHA nurses into it. Prior to the creation of the RHAs, nurses were public officers, but going across, taking a transfer to the RHAs, they no longer fall under the public service, and therefore their pension arrangements will have to be taken care of separately. Senator Mahabir asked the question, how many officers would benefit from this piece of legislation? I'm informed that there are 2,600 positions in the fire service, so that will give us an idea about how many persons will be eligible. Madam President, Senator Mahabir made a recommendation for the amendment of the legislation. And his amendment is that we must insert at 7C subclause 7A and B, where it talks about an officer retiring from the public service, instead of 2008, he wants to include prior to the proclamation of this date. And while anyone would understand the honorable intention of Dr. Mahabir, I wish to advise him that this is not a piece of legislation that is intended to catch all, going back to God knows how far, because we just don't have the authority to do that. The cabinet note and the cabinet decision was taken in 2008. And even for this present piece of legislation, the cabinet decision, the last cabinet decision, was taken in 2012.
Clarification. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Honorable Minister, for giving way. The clarification I need, Madam Minister, Honorable Minister, is this. Are there any public officers in Trinidad and Tobago who at this time retired prior to January the 1st, 2008, who acted in positions and who are in receipt of the pensions consistent with the substantive position that they left. Thank you.
Madam President, the Honorable Senator is posing a new question to me. Let the record show that. But I will try to accommodate him. I will always try to accommodate him. I am not in a position to give that information. That information could be sourced subsequent to today. But you see, Senator Mahabir, as I said, there's no authority to go before the cabinet date. We cannot go before 2008. It just can't be done. The last administration took the decision in 2012, but in seeking to bring parity, we cannot go beyond 2008. Now, Senator Wade Mark, I expect better of you, you know. As Senator Wade Mark, sorry, Madam President, he's my good friend. He's my good friend. I mean, Senator Mark stood up and said that fire officers are treated as bastard children. But you know, Senator Mark, I want to remind you and your bench that this piece of legislation, the decision was taken by your political leader in 2012. Let me repeat that. 2012. The UNC did nothing in 2012, nothing in 2013, nothing in 2014, and nothing in 2015, although it had 3 extra months in office. So therefore, to come and say that this government is treating fire officers as bastard children is a bit unfair. And I feel I have to challenge you on that point. Although I hear the other point that you make in terms of the need for updating the various offices and equipment of fire officers, and that will continue to be a work in progress. Now, Madam President, I have nothing else to say on the contribution of Senator Mark, since it was his prerogative to bring in other issues that he felt would make whatever impact. Now, Madam President, this piece of legislation, as I said, this bill before seeks to give effect to a collective agreement negotiated by the former administration on the 6th of March 2012. And this bill, the background to the act, which is, I believe, part of the memorandum of agreement. And that agreement was ratified by Cabinet Minute 643 of March 22nd, 2012. Madam President, and I wish my friends on the other side to note well, because they have been attempting to give the impression as though they have no responsibility in this whole situation. But I want to point out that on that day in March 2012, Cabinet agreed that the UNC Attorney General should amend the 5th schedule to the Fire Service Act to give effect to the terms of the agreement between the CPO and the Fire Service Association relating to pensions arrangement. That was not done. So don't come here and play you all so innocent. You all had all opportunity to change it, and you all failed to do that. And the cabinet decision was for your Attorney General at the time to make the necessary amendment to the 5th schedule. The agreement between the CPO and the Fire Service Association also address other areas, including salary, allowances, overtime, pension, and so on. The bill follows, Madam President, this bill follows other similar legislation that has been enacted since 2008 to give effect to agreements between the CPO and the PSA, the CPO and tutor, the CPO and the Prison Officers Association, the CPO and the Police Officers Association, and so on, to allow public officers to have superannuation benefits of their higher position upon retirement. Other similar legislation and the effective dates of implementation are as follows. In January 2004, the Pensions Act was amended to give effect for similar terms. At the same time, Regulation 183A of the Police Service Regulation was amended. On 1st of January 2005, the Assisted Secondary School Teachers Pension Act was amended to give effect to similar provisions. On January 1st, 2005, the Teachers Pension Act, Chapter 3902, was amended to give effect to similar provisions. And on 1st January 2007, the Prison Service Act was amended to give effect to similar provisions. So that, Madam President, what we have seen is an incremental adjustment to the various pieces of legislation to afford public officers the right to have a pension once they have served continuously for 3 years in the higher position. I've heard some very bizarre formulas used here in this chamber, and some really out of whack examples. But Madam President, I mean, I have been part of the public service for many, many years. I'm very, very familiar with the public service and how it operates. And I have known of no case, Madam President, where someone asks for 3 years and just before retirement, they were placed back into the substantive position. Doesn't work like that. That's a dream. That's a dream. That's a Nancy story. But what over the years that at the time, over the years, what we had observed was that public officers were disadvantaged, and therefore steps were taken to correct that. And as a matter of fact, Madam President, what we are doing here today is regularizing a situation to allow a fire officer who has acted in a higher position for a continuous period of 3 years prior to retirement to receive the benefits in the higher office, whether or not that fire officer is promoted to the position or not. Because before 2004, Madam President, when a public officer is acting in the higher post and that public officer is not promoted, then that public officer's pension was calculated in his or her substantive post, which was at the lesser salary, and they were really disadvantaged. The salient point here, Madam President, is that the matter was approved by Cabinet in 2012, and the then former administration did nothing at all after that. And this piece of legislation, this bill we have brought before this House, is an attempt to fix that. Madam President, I thank you. I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550 be now read a second time. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550.
Minister of Labour.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 57, I beg to move that this bill not be committed to a committee of the whole Senate.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550, not be committed to a committee of the whole Senate. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. Honourable Senators, the question therefore is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550, be now read a third time and passed. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Fire Service Act, Chapter 3550.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn to Thursday, 1st of June, 2017 at 2:30 p.m. At that point in time, we will conclude debate on the Motor Vehicle and Road Traffic Act.
Madam President, I want to put on the record for your consideration this unilateral, autocratic approach that the leader of government business has started in this Senate is not going to be accepted by the opposition, and therefore we are serving notice on him and his side that we are prepared to be consulted, Madam President. We are prepared to negotiate, but we are not prepared to be disrespected by the leader of government business or the government bench. And therefore, we are saying, Madam President, consistent with Standing Order 11.1, we know that we are supposed to meet at 1:30 and on a Tuesday, and we shall meet at 1:30. We also know, Madam President, that the Parliament regulates its own business, and that is why we are saying that we are prepared to be consulted, we are prepared to negotiate these matters, but we cannot tolerate a leader of government business coming here every other week and simply springing a surprise on this bench and saying we are going to deal with a 2:30 assignment. Madam President, may I also bring to your attention that the Cabinet is not in charge of this Parliament. The Cabinet is not in charge of the Parliament of the Republic of TNT. And Madam President, I draw this to your attention because there are several parliamentary committees that have already assigned their responsibilities in terms of workload until the first week of July. And I ask the leader of government business to please have consultations with the clerk of the Senate, your good self as the president, and the leaders of the respective benches, so we can find a reasonable solution to this problem. Otherwise, Madam President, we are going to go right into the first week of July and will not get the opportunity to deal with other parliamentary matters. And therefore, I am suggesting that we are prepared to engage in consultation with the leader of government business, but we are not prepared to be disrespected by the leader of government business every other Tuesday and say the next sitting is on Thursday at 2:30 because the Cabinet is meeting. That doesn't work like that. So I just want to put on record our position.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I rise on 11.1, given the normal sitting days of the Senate. I simply think, Madam President, that there is a need for consultation and information This is a surprise to me as well, not the Thursday sitting, but again at 2:30. And I really would think it would make for a more efficient management of the benches, certainly amongst the independent members, if we are, after due consultation with all the leaders and the coordinator, we are able to make a determination and to give agreement so this issue does not arise. I know the leader of government business, understanding Order 11.3, can do what he is doing, but really, with consultation, this situation does not have to arise, and there need be no rancor and ill will amongst the benches. Thank you very much.
Honourable Senators, I am hearing two things. What is within my purview is in respect of Standing Order 11. Now, Standing Order 11.1 says that we normally meet on a Tuesday at 1:30, but that is subject to Standing Order 11.3, which sets out that the Senate may, at any time, by any motion, suspend and vary that particular time, Tuesday at 1:30. That is the position on the Standing Order. With respect to collaboration, all I can ask is that members get together and the requisite persons and try and resolve the issues. I can't do that, okay? I am going now to suspend for 5 minutes so that there can be some discussion, so that when I return, we can deal with the motion for the adjournment, hopefully in a peaceful and manner, okay? So I will suspend this sit-in for 5 minutes.
Knox Street has been the site of a municipal building since 1899, when this key area around Woodford Square was home to several significant political and religious buildings. The present City Hall is a distinguished example of 1950s architecture, which reflected a move away from traditional colonial styles towards a more modern and functional aesthetic. In 1899, Cocoa Baron and Deputy Mayor Leon Agostini sold the property to the City Council for the sum of $38,000, and from then on it has been used for municipal purposes. Between 1899 and 1907, the Town Hall housed barristers' chambers, club rooms, and governmental department offices. A devastating fire in 1948, however, destroyed the building, and as a result, the administration of Port of Spain was conducted from the Prince's Building, which was at the south of the Savannah. Architects Pryor, Lorenco, and Northnagel were hired to design the new town hall. The architecture of the building came out of the post-World War II modernist movement. Trinidad and Tobago was developing quickly, and independence was in the air. There was a lot of interest in creating architecture that was moving in a new direction, away from traditional modes of building. The architecture of City Hall was adapted for the climate in a style that was called tropical modernism.
If you look at the number of features of the building in terms of common areas and the way that certain areas were naturally ventilated, the way that certain areas don't rely on air conditioning. And also if you look at the plan of City Hall, on the north side of Woodford Square there is a kind of courtyard area that opens out onto the sidewalk. They're buildings that were designed in consideration of the climate, Features were designed in terms of the building envelope, the circulation spaces, and there was a sort of maximization of the natural ventilation potential of the building. And also its relation to the sun at different times of the day, I think were carefully considered in buildings.
Large windows and well-placed breeze blocks allowed the open offices to be filled with light and air. Unlike previous colonial municipal buildings, the new City Hall was an accessible public building that also fit into the surrounding environment without dominating it. Even the auditorium used for various cultural and municipal purposes was designed to be
Madam President, if I can interject here, I've met with the leader of the opposition and the independent coordinator. They have made their case, and we will hopefully meet on this next Thursday, the 1st, at 2:30, and thereafter, if we are to meet on some other Thursday during the month of June, I'll make my best effort to card those sit-ins at 1:30 p.m., but I need to consult the Prime Minister in particular as to how the Cabinet is conducted to try to finish on time.
Honourable Senators, it really, at this stage, before I move the motion for the adjournment, we are going to be celebrating Indian Arrival Day, and therefore I'm going to invite the Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries to bring greetings.
Thank you kindly, Madam President. I rise and I take this opportunity with great privilege to bring greetings on behalf of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on this bench to the nation and the population at large on the celebration of the occasion of Indian Arrival Day. Madam President, on May 30th, 1845, some 172 years ago, the Fatal Rosa could have sailed to the shores of this country, bringing along the first set of Indian immigrants. And I dare say, Madam President, not only did it bring labor, but also it brought a new people to this country. Madam President, the circumstances in which my forefathers came to this country would have been various reasons. Some could debate whether it be foreign opportunity, economic prosperity, or in search of a better life. Whatever it was, Madam President, we are grateful. And on a personal note, having spent 25 days in India in 2013, I could say that I am very happy that my forefathers came to this land. Because, Madam President, some of the conditions I saw in India was really, against what we call humanitarian. And as I drove through some parts of the state, the Uttar Pradesh state, and even Punjab, where probably my ancestors, the Singh, the Sikhs, the warriors came from, Madam President, I dare say that a lot has not changed in these living conditions and these circumstances. Madam President, in the years 1845 and 1917, some 140,000 Indians would have been transported to this country. And bringing with that, Madam President, over the years, this country has grown to accept some of the customs and festivals, and I dare mention some of them. Events such as Diwali, Eid al-Fitr, Phagwa, and Husay. These festivals, Madam President, have in fact become part of our cultural fabric here in this country. Madam President, the indented laborers also brought their religion, food, clothing, and some of the places in our country is even named after some of the places like Faizabad, Barakpur, Chananagar, and so many others. When we look to even naming of our children, Madam President, and you look to the Hindu names for girls, things like Mohini, which means most beautiful. Madhuri means sweet girl, Madam President. My very own name, Avinash, means endless or boundless. My colleague, Being a Muslim name Kazim means restrainer or controller of anger. Madam President, these names are etched. These names, for another girl named Farida, Madam President, a Muslim girl child name Farida means unique. And Madam President, the list goes on. And I want to say, Madam President, that my great-grandfather, Mr. Inderjit Singh, his wife Parvati Singh, and one child, a 7-year-old, Rampasad Singh, not being my great-grandfather, but that of my great-grandfather's brother, would have came to this country and they were posted on the first estate in Pitimon and then later transferred to the Larisus station in Papuri Road. Madam President, coming out of all of this, this interaction and what the indentured laborers would have brought, you know, they were a little more lucky than a lot of the other persons who would have come to this country, because in that, being indentured laborers, they were allowed to practice their religion, they were allowed to practice, their culture. Some things even more evident now, and communities still go towards it, things like the panchayat system, where communal problems were dealt with. Madam President, more importantly, I mean, we can all attest to this. Just about an hour or two ago, we had some food upstairs, Madam President, and the national cuisine in Trinidad and Tobago now has so much to thank this population for. And we can name a few: the sada roti, dosti roti, paratha, dalpuri, and the sweets, kurma, doubles. Madam President, some of the fruits and vegetables, baigan, damadol, as we call it, tomato, dal, nariyal, which is coconut, and the list goes on, Madam President. And Madam President, growing up in a home where the culture was so evident of India, you almost could not be spared from licks from a dabla, for those of you who know, or dal gutni, which is the swizzle stick, and a bill. Now, how could we forget, Madam President? So all of these things are etched in our culture, and when one looks at the music and dance in our country, Madam President, from the contributions, we have tassa, tabla, dolak, majira, the sitar and harmonium, just to name a few. And one that I play, Madam President, which is the dantal, which was an Indian, Indian instrument that was made here in Trinidad and Tobago, because it was used from the bull carts. It's a piece of iron straightened, and then they used the horseshoe. And Madam President, I play it, and I play it very well. So these are just some of the things, Madam President, we have to thank this population for. We can look to the ghazals, the bihars, the classical Indian dances, and even chutney, Madam President. When one looks at even the fashion, the contribution to fashion, Madam President, sari, shalwar. I know my senator colleague, Khadija Amin, she loves to wear her gangri, Madam President, a long dress, and so on. Madam President, all in all, the Indian community in Trinidad and Tobago has proven to be a resilient people. We have adapted perfect in this country, and we have continued to contribute to the economic development of this country, the social stability of this country, the cultural diversity and national unity. Madam President, I am very proud, as a diaspora of the Indian culture and country, to stand here in this August chamber and address the nation on this occasion. And on behalf of the government, Madam President, I want to say particularly, how particularly pleased we are to be in this country where all of us could enjoy with boundless faith in our destiny, and here every creed and race find truly an equal place, Madam President. Thank you.
Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, on behalf of the alternative government and our esteemed opposition leader, the Honorable Kamla Prasad Bisesa, we wish on this bench to extend to the entire nation a happy Indian Arrival Day. On Tuesday, 30th of May 2017, we will be commemorating and celebrating the 172nd anniversary since the first group of contracted East Indian laborers came to our shores and came to Trinidad and Tobago, seeking greater economic opportunity. Our East Indian forefathers came to this country in continuous multitudes and worked extremely hard to provide a better future for themselves and their families. They also came to seek greater opportunity and performed valuable roles in making Trinidad and Tobago a land of great opportunity today. We live in a sea of diversity as we celebrate our collective humanity in an environment punctuated by our country's various multicultural backgrounds, multi-religious experiences, and multi-ethnic communities seeking to promote a better and a more just and peaceful society. So as we celebrate our 172nd anniversary on Tuesday, the 30th of May, 2016, we wish 2017, we wish the entire national community a happy and wonderful Indian Arrival Day. May I, on behalf of our bench, extend to the entire community of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly our East Indian brothers and sisters, a happy Indian Arrival Day to all inside and outside of this chamber. Madam President, may I also extend to all our senatorial colleagues on all sides of this honorable Senate and their respective families, the staff of the Parliament police officers, and to every single citizen and even visitor to our Twin Island Republic state, a happy Indian Arrival Day holiday. And Madam President, of course, to you and to your family, a happy Indian Arrival Day as well. In closing, I also cannot mention, and to extend at the same time, with your leave, to a living icon and legend, our own former Prime Minister and opposition leader, who is celebrating today his 84th birthday. I refer to the Honorable Baptiste-Primus, and I wish, on behalf of the opposition and our bench, to wish him a very happy birthday on this occasion.
Senator Mahabir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, on behalf of the independent bench, I consider it a great honor to be bringing greetings to the national community on the occasion of Indian Arrival Day. Madam President, I tend to see things a little bit differently from most. And on reflecting on the holiday, I pondered on the reason for the existence of Trinidad and Tobago's economy and society. Trinidad and Tobago started as a plantation agricultural economy, Without plantation agriculture, we had no reason for existence from the early days. And Madam President, plantation agriculture is unique. It requires huge quantities of cheap labor because the products of the plantations at the time were sold competitively as they are sold now. And the only cost under the control of the planter class was the wage cost. Slavery, as Dr. Eric Williams had argued convincingly, was expensive because there was a huge pension bill. And with the need to minimize labor costs, one saw the emergence of contract labor. Contract labor, starting with the Chinese in 1806, I think they too have reason to celebrate a day which commemorates the indentured immigrants. The Portuguese, somewhere around 1846, also came as indentures. And the Indians came in large numbers to form the bulk of the labor force in the plantations. But this was based upon exploitation. Exploitation defined simply to mean paying labor less than what labor contributed to the organization. And this exploitation could arise only because labor had nothing to sell but its labor power. Labor was not equipped with capital. And so you had to accept the exploitation and also at the same time accept the fact that you were not full citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. We were told that the indentured immigrants were second-class citizens. They were not, Madam President. I have two documents, two ID cards. One says, under nationality, citizen of the Commonwealth, belong to Lalmani Badal, that is my grandmother. And another ID card, Mahabir Tamoli, his nationality is British in the ID card, although it's a Trinidad and Tobago ID card. And one that belongs to a well-known face, Dineshwar Mahabir. I am a Trinidad and Tobago, citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. And I raise this, Madam President, because from the designation of citizen of the Commonwealth, British, in the case of my Aja, you found people who held the view that Trinidad and Tobago was the place to stay. Many of their friends returned to India, but they stayed, both of them. They stayed in the village of Cunupia after working out there, after buying their way out of a bound at the Woodford Lodge estate in 1918. And Indian Arrival Day is celebrated for a reason, in my mind. Here it is, two immigrants who had confidence in Trinidad and Tobago, more confidence in Trinidad and Tobago than they had in their home country. Confidence to stay and to start and grow a family here. And this confidence was not misplaced. As early as 1851, Lord Harris started a system of education for the children of the ex-slaves, much to the opposition of the planter class. And the colonial government, we do not know too much about what they did, but the colonial government went on a trust of education for the children of the immigrants. 31st of August 1931, the date when Cunupia Government Primary was opened. That's the primary school I attended. Opened under the colonial administration, in contrast to the planter class that wanted child labor, paying children 20 cents a day so that parents had an incentive not to educate. But the colonial government, the government of Trinidad and Tobago post-1946 when we had the franchise, the government from 1925 to 1946, and the government after 1956, every single government in Trinidad and Tobago provided opportunity for the children of the immigrants to educate themselves, to obtain human capital education. money capital via moving out of the plantation and physical capital. And what we are seeing, Madam President, today is that opportunities which were created by the government, in contrast to the efforts of the planter class, show that the government of Trinidad and Tobago always acted in the interest of all its citizens. And being in the Senate means that we continue with that tradition. We take this right for granted, Madam President. In Europe, many governments prevented the Jews from owning land. Not so in Trinidad and Tobago. Equality of opportunity for all. So when I celebrate Indian Arrival Day, and when we as a country celebrate Indian Arrival Day, it is as much a celebration of the hope realized of the indentured immigrant and a celebration of the type of society in which we and Trinidad and Tobago live. A society which from the earliest times, 1851, Lord Harris, started to provide opportunities for all. The success of the immigrants, therefore, in my mind, is a signal to the rest of the society that there should be no excuse for turning to a life of crime when the government, every single government, has provided the opportunity for advance. We simply need to look at what they have done, learn from them, and take advantage of the opportunities of the governments in the past and opportunities that governments will continue to provide. And so we celebrate Trinidad and Tobago as a society that provides opportunity. From the colonial days to now, we celebrate the confidence of the Indian immigrant, the confidence of all the immigrants before, the Chinese and the Portuguese, in Trinidad and Tobago, staying to build the society that we have. And while I celebrate all of these, Madam President, we know that it is important to bring greetings, but that we must also recognize that in Trinidad and Tobago, they are the First Nations people. I hope at some time we recognize the contribution of the First Nations of Trinidad and Tobago. So while I bring Indian Arrival Day greetings to the whole country, I say, let us give thanks for all that we have achieved and recognize all in our country who have made the type of contributions to make us into the country we are today. I thank you, Madam President.
Permit me, honourable senators, to join with you in wishing our citizens a happy Indian Arrival Day. As the historians among us would know, Indian immigration to Trinidad and Tobago spanned the period 1845 to 1917. During this period, over 140,000 Indians were brought to the island. Today, 172 years later, Trinidad and Tobago is the fortuitous beneficiary of this critical part of our nation's history. As we celebrate the 172nd anniversary of the arrival of these first indentured laborers to our shores, we celebrate the contributions made by these courageous men and women and by the generations that have followed them. We remember their struggles, we laud their victory over adversity, and we honor their love and dedication to our country. So, honorable members, I wish each and every one of you present here in this chamber and all of Trinidad and Tobago happy Indian Arrival Day. Honorable senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Thursday, the 1st of June, 2017 at 2:30 p.m. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. This Senate now stands adjourned to Thursday, the 1st of June, 2017 at 2:30 p.m.